I had the great good fortune to chair the board of World Wildlife Fund when we selected, and also the search committee, when we selected Carter Roberts, who was then head of planning for the Nature Conservancy, to be the president and CEO of WWF some 10 years ago. He had a career that was unusual at that time for the head of a international conservation organization. He had an MBA from Harvard and had worked in Procter & Gamble for some early part of his career. He also worked for Mass Audubon and, as I mentioned, the Nature Conservancy. He's created, I think, an extraordinarily effective organization. He inherited a good one. It's the largest international conservation organization. It has the best logo, and that makes it easy for him. I recall once being introduced in China as a Fulbright Exchange lecturer, and the minister who introduced me heard that he knew I was former EPA administrator, which was emphasized, and then he heard that I had been president of World Wildlife Fund. And he said, well, that's a Chinese organization. This is a Chinese minister. He said, everybody knows the World Wildlife Fund in China. And I thought,
yeah, it helps when your logo is
great
the symbol
logo
of China.
That's right. Carter has introduced any number of innovations, priorities, relationships that were not necessarily predictable on the part of WWF, but has had enormous influence in the organization, in the international global organization. There are something like 34, 35 national organizations that make up the network of WWF, where he has been one of the most influential figures there and has established relationships which are so much better than when I was running WWF, and they were quite tense. So he comes here as a international leader in conservation. And I'm going to start our conversation by asking Carter the reason that people join WWF as members. This was true when I was there. I assume it's still true. It was primarily for the wildlife. And the charismatic megafauna, probably more than any, the elephants, the tigers, the rhinos, and pandas themselves. So could we begin by asking, what's the status of those? How are they doing?
You know, the funny thing about animals is the more beautiful they are, the more the world covets them. And each of those animals so evokes wonder and awe that the world wants them, they want a part of them, and literally a part of them. And so we are, you know, when we started, white rhinos were down to about 50. And now there are 20,000 in the wild today. Mm-hmm. And I would regard that as one of our great success stories. Elephants have done very, very well until recently, and the ivory trade has just boomed. It's metastasized into this enormous global trade fueled by crime syndicates. It basically funds groups like Al-Shabaab. 50% of their revenue comes from ivory.
Wow.
And last year we lost 30,000 elephants, and it's a global crisis, and it's one that's gripped the world. And we're working really hard on that. I just came out of a wonderful session with National Geographic and GlobeScan, which is an international research group, which finally is beginning to interview who buys the ivory and why. And it is shockingly, disproportionately young, 18 to 35. Slightly skews toward women. And then it's largely toward gift giving. And why? Because the animal's so beautiful and it's so rare that it makes the gift all the better. And we are looking into what motivates them to do that, because they trust NGOs more than anybody, including celebrities. They get the importance of the rule of law, and China just made an announcement that they're going to shut down the ivory trade. But these individuals will keep buying ivory because it's cool. So given how young they are and given the importance of social media, we need to find entirely new ways to make it uncool in China. And so we got our work cut out for us. Now, on tigers, it's very similar. It's much more shadowy. Tigers are down to 3,200 in the wild. They were down to 3,200. And we launched a global initiative to double their numbers, and I'm pleased to report 5 years later, that curve has turned back up, and now they're about 4,200 in the wild. And that's a result of amazing things happening in places like Nepal, of all places, where the number of tigers has tripled because of communities that care about the revenues from a park. They share the revenues in parks. And also the role of the government, but they've now begun to track poachers. We have a partnership with Google that's testing drones in Nepal. And we've now been able to track the poachers to the traders, to the kingpins in the capital cities and bringing them to justice. So that's why tigers are on the upturn.
Terrific.
Now, but it's interesting that you talk about our logo and the species and everything, because when I started, in addition to getting angry phone calls from members of World Wrestling Federation that were really colorful, threatening all kinds of damage to me because we just won the lawsuit, I quickly realized that people thought that we were nice people saving fuzzy animals in the wild. And that is a small part of our work, but it's our core DNA, just as, you know, I always say if you want to look at an organization, you should look at the act of conception, because the basic DNA is baked in the first thing they do. And for TNC, that was 1946, when a group of scientists took out second mortgages on their home to buy Mianus River Gorge to save it. And the idea of a financial transaction to save a place is baked into TNC's bones. And if you look at EDF, it was the early work on DDT and pesticides and changing regulations to save peregrine falcons and other species. And for us, it was drawing the world's attention to species in places far, far away. But we have now morphed into a completely different organization. But we have to keep talking about species because that's still part of our
DNA.
core.
I looked recently at the Millennium Development Goals, which have been remarkably successful. Hardly anybody knows it, it seems, that in terms of the major diseases, particularly the reduction of child mortality, kids under 5 has been reduced by 50%. The poverty, extreme poverty dropped 50% down to 13% of the world at this point. People make under $1.25. I don't have the impression that the conservation objectives did so well. Am I wrong?
No, there were 8 Millennium Development Goals, and you're right, they galvanized the world's attention and made great progress in all of them except for number 7, which was achieve environmental sustainability. And almost unlike all the other ones, it was poorly defined, did not have great metrics. But I'm pleased to say that on September 25th, the nations of the world came together and committed to a new version of those, the Sustainable Development Goals. There are now 17 of those, and when you look at them as a set, you see the environment embedded in at least half of those, from clean energy to climate, to life under the water, to life on land, to responsible supply chains, and on and on and on. It is remarkable how much the world now recognizes how important the environment is to human health. And, 17 priorities is too many priorities. But I predict that these will drive a lot of change in the world as governments seek to achieve them.
And that has implications for your program. The way that you relate to development. I remember in my time, it was a major innovation. We did Debt for Nature, and we recognized that it was not enough simply to get protected areas, that unless you engaged the surrounding economy and made it worthwhile to the people who lived in and around these protected areas, you would fail. Your time, you have spread very significantly into agricultural commodities and relationships with those who produce those commodities, trade in those commodities. How did you arrive at that?
Well, it's interesting. Stepwise, we went from species to the places they live in, to looking at big ecosystems like the Amazon, realizing that people live there and work there, just as you say, and then realizing that in it, we've done great things. Like in the Amazon, we helped the government of Brazil create a system of parks. equal to 1.5 Californias. I mean, that's just huge. But when we still look at a map of Brazil, and this month's National Geographic has a great new map of Brazil that one of our fellow board members helped spearhead, Tom Lovejoy. When you look at a map of Brazil, it is still going to get shredded by infrastructure, by dams, bridges, and roads that all the countries want to build to connect, and by food, whether that's beef or soy. And the same is true at the heart of Borneo, and where it's palm oil, and the same is true of places like the Mesoamerican beef due to overfishing. And so when we looked at the reality of saving the places we loved, and we tallied up the biggest threats, climate change was not the number one threat, immediate threat. It's not the snake at the door. The snake at the door is food production. It's going to break the back of the places we love first. And then climate change will kill them over time. And of course, food and climate change are interwoven. So we got a significant bequest from the granddaughter of the man who founded UPS. And we took almost all of it and put it into building a food program. And now we have 60 people in Washington, D.C., and about 250 people globally who do nothing but look at food commodities, building sustainable certification programs, and then engaging the 100 biggest companies to commit to that. And out of the 100 biggest companies in the world, we now have MOUs, close partnerships with about 75 of them. So this has been a real juggernaut for us.
And these are the major commodities that are the principal
it's
measures of
beef,
that.
palm oil, cotton, sugar, soy, 12 species in aquaculture, on and on and on, and timber, pulp and paper. And some are easier than others. The hardest is beef, and it's one that has the biggest footprint. But we have a partnership with JBS in Brazil, with McDonald's, with Walmart, with Cargill, on and on, to get after beef in a serious way.
You're awfully cozy with a lot of companies.
You know, it's interesting. People ask me about that all the time, and
Sure.
I would maintain that our partnership with companies doesn't mean anything if our brand doesn't mean anything. And our brand only has value if we maintain our virtue and our integrity, and we do that by setting hard targets with each company that drives improvement in their behavior. And if all it is about money, we won't do it. But we will enter a partnership if a company sets ambitious targets on energy or on water or on the footprint of the food they buy, and then we'll enter into a partnership, and we measure that. And in every agreement we have, we maintain the right to speak independently. And we cannot end up being a shell for the partners that we work with, and they don't expect that from us either, not usually.
Have your work with companies and emphasis on commodities, have they been picked up and supported by the international network of World Wildlife Organizations?
Yeah, so we have 100 countries around the world in which we work, and this is one of the hottest areas. Now, what's interesting is if you go to Brazil, if you go to India, if you go to the Philippines, if you go to Indonesia, this is one of the core parts of their program. If you go to Europe, my European colleagues have sometimes different notions about food. And that touches on GMOs, and that touches on the old idea of large-scale intensification. And so we have a really healthy debate within our network, but by and large, we just committed to a whole new set of goals. And they are very ambitious goals on food, on land use, on food waste, and on certification programs as a network. So that's changed. But if you ask, does the United States and Germany think the same way about food? They don't. But we're working through those differences.
You have a position on GMOs?
Yeah, we have a position on GMOs. It took us 2 years to come to a position on GMOs. What we found is that, first of all, when you talk about genetics and crops, there's a whole spectrum of genetics from basic hybrids. Genetics started, if you really define it that way, in Oaxaca, when the early indigenous groups started to turn teosinte into a form of corn that we could eat. And so if you go from that to looking at markers where you can grow cacao using a lot less land, energy, and water, where the trees last longer, all the way to hardcore GMOs, there is a spectrum, and the question is, where do you draw the line? We've decided we are not for or against GMOs. What we are for are crops that use less land, energy, and water, that maintain the sustainability of the ecosystem in which they are grown, and also that respect human rights. And there's one other one that I can't think of right now, but we have measures like that, and we hold those food sources accountable for that. And in every case, what we've now negotiated is that there is a small portion that would be GMO-free that you could sell into Germany. But by and large, the work that we do, if you really want to get to scale, if you want to get to scale in any big commodity, you can't be against GMOs. If you really want to get to scale and change in saving the Amazon or saving these, because the vast majority of large producers are already involved in some kind of genetics. Now, as I said before, there's a large spectrum. And so we're not against it, but we have hardcore standards on impact.
What are the implications for the programs and the priorities you described for your own organization, for the way you deploy science, for the way you make decisions about which areas deserve priority protection?
Yeah, you know, I was at the Nature Conservancy for 15 years, and I headed up their science and planning program, or at least a chunk of it, for a while. And 20 years ago, the art of conservation science was to identify the most important places in the world to save. And WWF pioneered the use of ecoregions, the Global 200, CI came up with the notion of hotspots, and today, that science has all been settled. You know, we know what the most important places in the world are. Now the question is, can we get to scale fast enough to make a difference? And 10 years ago, our strategy was to conserve the 19 most important places on Earth by whatever means. And 10 years later, as Bill, as you recall, we had a board meeting, and I reported on our Living Planet report, which tracks populations of a market basket of species around the world, and has done so for 40 years. And that line keeps going down, inexorably down, even though we celebrate all these successes. And we also track humanity's footprint in the Global Footprint Index, and that line keeps going up. Whereas 5 years ago, we were consuming 1.3 times what the planet can sustain. Now we're at 1.5. And I decided I didn't want to go past my 10th anniversary and preside over an organization that was celebrating these small achievements while the world kept going to hell in a handbasket. And so, as you recall, we decided to look at the Sustainable Development Goals, or what they were going to be. We set 6 big goals and 3 sub-goals for each. And then we reoriented the whole organization around what role could we play in helping the world achieve those. And then we started talking about what institutions are most important to achieve those goals, and reorienting ourselves to think about how do we influence those institutions and the systems in the world that they either drive or influence. So that's a brave new world for us, and it relies on our staff thinking very much about these larger systems. Tom Friedman in New York around the SDGs said, the heroes in our movement are people who can understand complex systems and the small tweaks you can make in them to move them in a new direction. And that's the kind of thinking we're doing more of.
Your board chairman, Neville Isdell, former chairman and CEO of CocaCola, commented when you were out of the room last week.
You're not supposed to talk about this in public.
That you have been very unusual in that you have made such significant changes in your own priorities and strategies 10 years into your job. Those decisions obviously had consequences. How did you get them accepted by your very large staff?
So in the first instance, we had to look at the burning platform of the world, and which is the call for change. And it's those lines going in the wrong direction year after year. Nobody who works in our business can ignore those lines. And then we said, okay, we need to set goals, and not our goals for what we're going to achieve, but what the world needs to achieve. And then we said, what kind of organization should we look like? And then we systematically said, okay, what part of our network should do that work, and what part should we embrace? It's kind of, it is the philosophy of comparative advantage. We should not do in the United States what Indonesia should do or what China should do. And so we looked hard at what parts should we shut down and move to other parts of the world. And then we looked at what parts of what we're doing now simply don't matter against the notion of scale. And then we made cuts, and we eliminated about 25% of our positions in Washington, D.C. And I have to tell you, the night before we did that was a sleepless night, and we made that happen. We did it as well as we could. And we also, it was extremely painful. And 18 months later now, you can feel the organization's mojo is back. And the network, strangely, looked at this and asked me to chair a strategy for the whole network, which now took the network through the same process, and on the Lofoten Islands off of Norway, our whole network committed to moving in the same direction. And that's could be a watershed event for us.
Well, it was a daring decision. And,
to ask an American to lead a global process?
In the network I'm familiar with, yes, actually. But to make the organizational decisions that you made, and as you know, some of us received angry calls from some of the people who were inconvenienced by them. But it was a decision to, as I understand it, embed science in the operational activities and priorities of the programs, rather than to have science separated.
Oh yeah, let me just talk about that. Previously, we were organized where we had field programs, policy staff, science, communications, markets, or I work with the private sector, and each one of those was its own tribe. The field people, the hardcore biologists, were suspicious of our private sector folks who all had private sector backgrounds. And the policy folks were, occupied a different world than the markets people did. And what we did was basically take that organization oriented that way and turned it sideways. And then had 6 integrated teams. And science was one of those. Science was one of those tribes. Science sat in the corner of our building. They had daily powwows. They had a killer ultimate frisbee team. And they lived in they produced lots of great reports, but they were not connected as much as they should to the organization. And so when we turned the organization sideways, so the scientists were all embedded in these different teams, they felt like we had broken up the band. And now I can tell you that we now have scientists knocking on our door, and we're devoting a lot more money to science to be a part of an organization that is so goal-driven. And then also really pushing hard on innovation to get to scale. And that's been gratifying, because the week after we made these changes, a major science publication, one of the 2 biggest in the world, ran an article saying that we had gutted science, because they also got the calls that you got.
I was impressed that you quoted John Saul the other day as to how he used experts. He said, consult the clients, find out what their problems are. And that's essentially the strategy you took.
Yeah, we were talking about impacts. I think in the previous session, I think Jim Saltzman was talking about impacts, and we don't measure impacts often enough as a community, and it's true. We just don't. We don't have enough evidence that the work we're doing is really making a difference. And so holding a mirror up to ourselves, whether or not our rhetoric is really true, are we really saving the Amazon? is part of the role of science, which is to hold a mirror up to ourselves. But the other role is, I think, is really to look at the problems we're trying to achieve in the world and where are we stuck. And in John Saul's world, where he goes to, he convenes all the biggest customers and says, where are you stuck? And how do we solve that problem? And I've had great long talks with John about that. And that's how our science should operate. And so we're moving in that direction, stepwise.
I have found that one of the priorities that you have is less understood by the larger public, and that has to do with oceans and marine resources. It was certainly true prior to the Royal Caribbean agreement you reached, where the senior vice president said, I just looked at the logo and thought, well, that's a land animal, and at any rate, not
nice people saving fuzzy animals.
Right.
There are not a lot of fuzzy animals in the ocean.
Right. But we do, in fact, you do, in fact, have a significant ocean marine resource program.
We actually have a huge ocean program that starts with helping different governments of the world create protected areas, marine protected areas. But it also goes to work with communities on small-scale fisheries in places like Mozambique and in Indonesia. But probably the biggest part of our work is on fisheries. It is on working on large-scale fisheries, and how do you engage companies in that? So, for instance, we've done a lot of work on tuna. Tuna is the most valuable fish in the ocean. One bluefin tuna sold for over $1 million in the Japanese market. And we built a partnership with the biggest tuna companies in the world called the International Sustainable Seafood Foundation that brings 80% of the purchasing power in the tuna industry together with a couple of NGOs to basically say, we're not going to buy tuna unless you can tell us where each fish came from and how it was caught. And that same group is now engaging the big Japanese fleets in the long line practices that they have. And so you're beginning to pile up buying power to influence the sector. And we've done the same thing with farmed salmon, and we're doing the same thing in these other commodities. And so that's the biggest part of our oceans work right now is on fisheries.
The tradition of attention to markets, the Marine Stewardship Council particularly, is well established at WWF, and you're going to take it further with a Markets Institute. Are you prepared to talk about that yet?
Well, I guess I am going to talk about the Markets Institute. It's interesting. We have, one of the great joys in my job is working with smart people, and one of the smartest we have is Jason Clay, who did a TED Talk about how companies can can save the world, and it's all about, I asked Jason once, I said, name the top 10 companies for the top 15 commodities, and he put them all in a chart and put the logos. Instead of the names in a list, put the logos, like Hollywood Squares. And he put that up on the screen in the TED Talk, and bam, it got the world's attention, because nobody wants to see their logo there, but once you put their brands there, it really, really got the world's attention. I know for a fact that there was the gentleman who ran, Gavin Neath, who ran Unilever's sustainability program, saw that, called Jason as he was driving across the Bay Bridge, and said, how can we put that into practice? And Gavin went back to his boss, Paul Pullman, who went to Davos, and that was the beginning of the Consumer Goods Forum commitment to end deforestation. And it happened from that slide to Gavin Neath, to Paul Pullman, to the Consumer Goods Forum. And it's a story that's never told, but that's the kind of influence that it's had.
That's terrific. Let me ask you about, for the students who are here, what are you hiring for? What do you look for when you're thinking of strengthening your staff? There are people out there who are looking at you and thinking, I want to be president of World Wildlife Fund. What should they be thinking about and doing to prepare for that day? I should add, too, that the point that Fred Krupp made eloquently this morning in talking about his priority for diversity within the organization and also within the movement.
So, it's interesting on diversity because we work in 100 countries. We are exceedingly diverse as an organization. You come to our meetings, and it is like going to the United Nations. I mean, it is a thing to behold.
Yeah.
But and we're actually trying to move more and more of our centers of power and capacity to other parts of the world right now in a big way. But it's funny, I actually dreamed of coming to the Nicholas Institute, to the Nicholas School, I think 15 years ago. And my boss at the Nature Conservancy convinced me to apply. And I did for this program where you can be here for a year and then continue your studies back. And I desperately wanted to do this. And then, at the last second, what I gather is you accepted 2 people that year. The other person was Andreas Lenhoff, who just became the Minister of Environment in Guatemala. When they threw the president of Guatemala into jail and the vice president into jail and they created a new government overnight, they asked one of your graduates to be the Minister of Environment. The problem is he works for us. And so I've now got a big hole in Central America. But I remember coming here and asking the students about, how can I get in? How do I do this? And they all really encouraged me to come because what they really wanted was my job. But I would say right now the great things that happen in our field come from people who can connect the dots. And I have a few mentors in my life who are all people who could connect the dots. John Sawhill, who hired me into the Nature Conservancy, was one of Dr. Deming's disciples, became president of NYU at age 39, went on to be McKinsey's the head of their energy practice, and then was the undersecretary of energy until he got fired for saying that we should put a price on gasoline, a price on carbon, to manage our energy demand. And then he was president of the Nature Conservancy, and he knew how to connect the dots. Another person I really admire is Hank Paulson, who's worked both at Treasury and at Goldman Sachs and at the Nature Conservancy. And the other one who epitomizes that is Bill Riley, who, you've heard of him.
God, I thought you'd never get there.
But, who has worked in government, in the NGO sector, and in the private sector. And I would say the people in our work who are like gold are the people who can connect the dots between government policy, private sector levers, the financial markets, and science and understanding civil society. And we have a few people who were at the intersections and know how to surf those intersections. That is where the good stuff happens. So I would say to all of you, in your studies here, if you can take courses in other schools, and actually Duke is one of the best at this. The interdisciplinary studies here is superb. If I'd done it all over again, I wouldn't have gone to just HBS. I would have loved to have gotten a joint degree with some other part of Harvard. My wife, who worked at EDF for 25 years, had a joint degree from Yale. And I think the joint degree program here is better than any other school in the country. And I would encourage you guys to just, even if you're not getting that, take courses in other studies, learn how to connect the dots between those disciplines, and in your career, do that as well.
This is a place that's especially good at that. Let me ask you about Paris and how WWF is prepared for negotiations in Paris.
Yeah, WWF has an outsized presence in all of these conference of parties because we have so many people in so many parts of the world. And having slogged through the snow in Copenhagen and having been in Cancun with the head of CocaCola and the head of Dow and announcing the Consumer Goods Forum commitments, we are looking at Paris, and we know that Paris is going to be a big moment because 160 countries have already put their targets on the table, because countries like the US and China have done the unthinkable in announcing their commitments together, because it looks like there will be a commitment to review and renew the commitments every 5 years. We call that the ratchet. And we think that there will be an agreement that brings transparency to what countries are doing. So that is all good. And we will celebrate that. But in the same sentence, we will also point out then when you look at where business as usual and where Paris is going to get us and where we need to do to get to 2 degrees C, and even 2 degrees C is not going to save the oceans, then we think Paris is going to get us about halfway there, which begs the question, how do we fill the rest of the gap? And so we are right now working with different countries on bilaterals to come forward with additional agreements. But we think even as soon as Paris is done, we're going to have to keep at it.
There's obviously a disjunction between our politics and our attention to some of the most serious threats to the environment. 10 years ago, we conducted a poll before starting up the Institute, which revealed that the public, by and large, approached the environment as a solved problem, and additional environmental initiatives as likely to cost jobs. Today we see this tremendous support reflected in the polls for recognizing that the climate's changing, that humans are contributing to it, but very little consequential action relative to the Congress, to voting. It doesn't show up on the list. You have a large membership, worldwide membership. Other countries that are part of the WWF network have gone much farther in terms of public involvement and support for these kinds of issues. How do we get at that issue? How do we get at the country at large?
Well, you know, this is this is the big question, and there is no question that it helps change the narrative when the chairman of Cargill comes forward and says, we should be very, very afraid of how we're going to grow crops to feed the world in a world with changing climate. It begins to change the narrative when the Department of Defense comes forward and talks about the importance of a stable climate in terms of ensuring security in the world. And those things begin to change the narrative. Even, you know, in our work, we're about to launch something called the Food Security Games with Cargill, Center for American Progress, the Center for Naval Analysis, and looking at droughts, food availability, price spikes, and how different countries respond and what happens to not only to those crops, but also to the environment. And that's where it starts to bite. The real question, I think, in our country is how do you change the narrative in the Republican Party? And because the polls, I mean, among the rank and file, among our population at large, the awareness and the appreciation and the understanding and the commitment is moving. But how do you change the politics in our country? Because we're not going to solve the problem. We're not going to put a price on carbon without both parties getting behind it. And that is a Nobel Prize should go to the person who changes the narrative in the Republican Party on climate change. And you and I have mutual friends who are working hard on that. And you know, when you ask who were the great presidents on environmental issues in the history of our country, half of them are Republicans. You know, when you look at John McCain running on for president, talking about climate change, even both Bush administrations talked about climate change. We need to change that narrative in a big way, and I am convinced that it will happen because the world is changing and the economic effects are devastating. I'm convinced it'll happen. The question, will it happen fast enough?
One of the contributions I thought that the encyclical by Pope Francis made was to redefine dominion in the Old Testament, which, as I understand it, on the part of evangelicals, has to do with the sense that to imagine that we are controlling the climate is to arrogate to ourselves powers that belong to God. And defining dominion in that way, to those who care about Scripture, and evangelicals do, it seemed to me, was to give a moral dimension, but a more felicitous one from the point of view of acknowledging, as I think it's Inglis has said, well, think of it in terms of impacting on your neighbor. And if you think of it that way, causing fires, pollution, whatever it happens to be, well, that's the one way to analogize to the climate if we're going to have emissions of carbon dioxide. Do you think that'll make a difference?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. So I have a Harvard MBA. I spent a lot of my career in the business sector. And I believe it's really important to place a value on the environment and move markets in its favor. But I don't think we will solve the problem entirely with economic arguments or with pricing or with markets. I think a big part of what motivates people to save the environment is just sheer ethics. And it's the right thing to do. And it is what the Pope says about creation and about stewardship and about when he stands in front of Congress and recites the Golden Rule. That was the most powerful moment, which is to think about all the other people who inhabit this planet with us and think about all the other creatures who inhabit this planet with us. And I think the moral dimension of the problem is just as important as the economic one. So, you know, it's interesting. We work in Bhutan and Cambodia and Nepal and in places where you talk about enabling conditions. When you work in countries where Buddhism is the prominent religion that venerates all living sentient beings, our work is infinitely easier. And I think tapping into that part, the moral dimension of what we're doing, is just as important as the economic one.
On that note, I think we will close this session and the program today.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you, Carter.
Thanks, Bill.